I got to ask my wife when the next race is. She's the one that gives me permission. And with that, I want to thank Stephanie. Obviously, Stephanie was behind us during the campaign, one of the first endorsers, and we're thrilled to, actually, I met you at the Combat Vets for Congress in person, where we did a video exchange, and I think I offered a little bit of direction. You told me you've got a pen now.
Exactly.
It's designed as a result of that interaction. Yes. So we've always been thrilled with iCaucus. I mean, it's a group that's after my own heart. Want to just mention real quickly, Kathleen is not just obviously my better half, but she's also very important. She's a big deal in Alaska. A lot of people think, oh, it's Joe Miller, but actually, Kathleen sits on the Judicial Council, and in fact, we'll probably have to leave here a little bit early this afternoon because she is involved with the selection of judicial candidates in Alaska. She's one of the votes from the citizen group that is actually very much involved in that, and we need good judges in Alaska, as we'll talk about a little bit later. Also, my daughter Kelsey, who lives here in the kind of in the San Diego area, a little bit south of here. Another reason that it made it very good for us to come up here, not to mention the fact that we are now missing that season in Alaska that some people in Alaska don't hold all that dear. We've had very cold weather recently, although we're in a warm spell right now. I think we're at 25 degrees. But for the 2 weeks prior to that, it was in the 40 below zone. So some of the coldest weather Alaska's ever experienced this time of year. So global warming is not coming to Alaska. And we have great weather in the summers, no doubt about it. I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of my political growth, my education. I mean, that really is at the core of it. We've got to educate this nation to understand why things are the way they are and how we need to change things. My experience in the Alaskan election was an eye-opener. I'm not going to bore you with a lot of details, but I grew up in Kansas, rural Kansas. I'm a sixth-generation Kansan. One of the first people in my family to kind of strike out. I think I've got that pioneering gene. Always looked at Alaska as kind of that last frontier, young state, opportunity. But kind of what formed my attitudes and my ideals. Like Nick, born in 1967, grew up kind of in that latter years of the Vietnam era, so the military was always front and center. Remember, not that we watched a lot of TV as a kid, but watching the newsreels of the guys in combat. And at an early age, I decided I wanted to serve my country. The space age, of course, was at the peak, walked on the moon. We really felt that there was nothing that was beyond the grasp of the United States of America. I mean, it was a great time to be alive, and then, of course, we hit the Carter years, and the malaise took over. And that was high school, the latter part of it, and then Reagan, offered hope. Reagan is kind of an interesting guy. I mean, if you really evaluate the politics of that, he was not intended to be president. The political establishment did not want him. He was the last, in my perspective, good Republican president that we've had, in the sense that he offered, really, I believe, an ideal that harkened back to what the founders intended. I think it wasn't perfect, none of us are. But the fact of it is, it was a time that you could have pride in country. I decided to apply for the military academies, went to West Point, went back to Kansas, chose the first ID as my station, and we were one of the first groups that ended up getting deployed over to Desert Storm. And like Nick, served in the only branch in the Army, the Armor Corps, and it was quite the experience. Learned a lot. It's helped inform me on my foreign policy views. Something that if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about where I think our nation needs to go in that direction. But anyway, I've always been politically engaged. When we went to Alaska, so after law school, like I said, I mean, one of the parts that motivated me to go to Alaska, last frontier, new opportunity, and I always in the back of my mind thought, political leadership, Alaska does have opportunity. It's not, from my perspective, not a corrupt state, young state, political establishment, young, lots of opportunity. But I ended up going into the judicial field, was a state magistrate and then a U.S. magistrate judge. And during those years, I could not be engaged politically, kind of donate to political candidates, kind of be involved. And so I really didn't get engaged in the political process in Alaska until 2004. And that's when I ran for the state legislature. We lived in a district that was one of the most liberal districts in Alaska. Now, I mentioned somebody earlier today, Alaska's a land of contradictions. A lot of people perceive it as that conservative, rugged, individualist state. There are many aspects that don't meet the eye. One of which is we've got a lot of liberals up there. In fact, the University District, which is where we were at in Fairbanks, has had a Democrat in it for many, many years. Lisa Murkowski's sister actually ran in this district. Several years before that, she ended up losing to the Democratic incumbent by 20, 30, 40 points. It was a huge game. I think she ended up with 28%, so it was a very difficult race. But I felt like we needed leadership, and so we ran, did not have the political establishment support. In fact, our district chair asked me at one point, who gave you permission to run? I thought, what in the world? You've got to be kidding me. And the same individual went down to Anchorage and persuaded the big money in the state not to donate to my campaign because I did not have permission to run. We still ended up coming within 3 points of defeating the Democrat incumbent. And that didn't really shock the nation, but it did shock a lot of people in Alaska that we came that close. I went on a medical mission trip to the Philippines with a good friend of mine, a doctor. That next spring, my wife kind of had my proxy at the district, and she nominated me for district chair, and this very individual had gone down to Anchorage and said, don't donate to this guy, got replaced by me. And I wasn't even there. And so that kind of launched us into politics in Alaska. It was shortly after that, several weeks after that, I was elected to the regional chair of the Republican Party in Alaska, one of 6 positions, and then I decided to try to root out corruption in Alaska. One of the only party officials that supported Palin. We, before that time, actually tried to get rid of Randy Ruderick, who was our chair, maintained still the chairmanship of the Republican Party in Alaska, made a solid effort to do so. We had a majority of the delegates that we convinced at the Republican Party convention to support us, but because he was midterm, it was going to require a suspension of rules or a 2/3 vote. We're very, very close to that, just shy of it. But needless to say, amongst the establishment, I did not make a name for myself. And had a big old target on my back. Several years after that, Kathleen and I contemplated what do we do about this horrible leadership that we have in the U.S. Senate. And really it wasn't Lisa Murkowski that motivated this. It was really a deep-seated understanding this country is headed in the wrong direction. And I saw the ruling class in the United States Senate, the United States Congress, as being at the core of that issue. And of course, Lisa Murkowski fell right in with all of them. Of course, she was an immensely popular political candidate. A political figure in Alaska. You had a 30-year Murkowski dynasty. Frank Murkowski, of course, was the senator before her. Frank became governor, then appointed his daughter to his position. And that just kind of encapsulates the type of corruption that's gone on. Most of our U.S. senators and representatives have been appointed to the office prior to actually reaching. In fact, we were struggling to think about whether or not there's been any Republican that's been a U.S. rep or senator that has not been elected initially, or that has not been appointed initially. And there may be one back there somewhere, but the fact of it is most people that reach political power in federal office in Alaska come out of appointments and then use their incumbency to ensure re-election. Of course, everybody's heard of Ted Stevens. Ted Stevens being basically the port king, drove tremendous amounts of money into the Alaska economy. And I think it's important what I want to kind of do is go through the election process. And the reason why I think that's important because it shows, at least at the primary level, how our involvement can make the difference. And it really can. If you're active, if you're involved, if you're dedicated to the cause, it can make the difference. Something that I think maybe we ought to think about when we evaluate whether or not we can actually have impact is the numbers that it takes. When you look at, for example, the number of voters in this country, it's just the registered voters, those that qualify to vote, 70%. If you look at those that actually go on to register, it's something like 60% of those that are qualified. So now you're down to 42% of the general population. And then you evaluate who actually goes out to vote. It's something like 50% of those that have registered. So now you're down to 21%. And then you look at, how people vote. All the time, a third of them vote Democrat. All the time, a third of them vote Republican. Now, these are just rough figures. But that leaves the swing vote on average of about 7% of the general public, which means that you've got to convince a little over 3% plus 1 to vote for your candidate. And that's effectively what we did in the primary. In the general, of course, we saw what the establishment did. And I think that's what I want to spend my focus on, is talking about that so that we can really evaluate how we need to approach the political scene to be effective.
You want something to drink real quick?
What's that? Sure, thank you.
He drinks a lot of coffee, rock stars, not enough water.
Yeah, but Kathleen knows me quite well. In fact, she's obviously the #1 fan and also the most effective part of the process. And one of the things that I will tell you is when you evaluate how you can help, don't think it's just necessarily in the trenches, because what we confronted was this deep-seated understanding of where we were at as a country, We weren't part of the political establishment. In fact, we were a target by the political establishment, but we were both convinced something had to be done. And even though Murkowski had 70% approval ratings, in fact, throughout most of the primary, 70% approval ratings by the polling that we had, we still decided it had to happen. We don't have large wealth. I mean, I had a successful law practice, but I wasn't born with money. We did not have the capacity to fund a multi-million-dollar campaign, but we decided that we had to do something, and so we stepped forward. And that's what all of us can do. But you've got to have the family support to do it. You've got to have your family behind it. You know, we talked to the kids were behind it. They were a major part of the campaign as well. I could not imagine, had the family not been behind that process, it would have split it. There's no doubt. With the tensions, with the type of things that we faced, you've got to have a strong core. So if that doesn't fit you, then you probably ought to find a candidate to support. But if you got your family support and there's nobody else stepping forward, you need to do it, because that's what we did. We declared on April 19th of 2010, we were the last major federal campaign to announce its candidacy. In fact, the FEC, a number of the Senate Ethics Committee, didn't even have us on their sheet, and that led to an issue later on in the campaign because we never got the Senate disclosure information that was required to be filed. One of the points that was made against us in the general election, but it was just unheard of that you would have a major campaign start just a matter of 4 months prior to the primary. But that gave us a lot of work. I was not a household name in Alaska. You know, as a magistrate in a small district out in eastern Alaska, and then as U.S. magistrate judge, I was senator in Fairbanks. And so even though I made a little bit of press with respect to what we did in trying to unseat the Republican Party chair, we still had to get name recognition, and we had to let people know where we're at. So we sat down, we decided to run. 3 days later, we announced on April 19th, Lexington Concord Day, and we hit the ground running. One of the first things that we did is we worked with those folks that, of course, were involved in trying to root out the corruption in the party. We made contacts with them. We got them involved in the organization of the campaign. Because we had started so late, we weren't really in place to get a campaign manager. We looked, in fact, never did find throughout the entire campaign an effective campaign manager. Frankly, during the primary, I was the campaign manager, and I was also the funder of the campaign for the most part. We ended up later on in the campaign having some major endorsements, which helped us out quite a bit. But it is important that you have at least a fiscal plan at play, because even though you may be completely motivated, completely dedicated to changing the country, and even though you want to knock on 100,000 doors, the fact of the matter is, in order to get your word out, it is going to require funding. And so if you don't have it yourself, then you're going to have to develop that fundraising network amongst like-minded conservatives. Again, you know, one of the major positives of these groups that are coming forward, whether you call them reform-oriented, conservative, Tea Party, whatever, iCaucus is a good example. Networking is so critical, and the network, of course, or the avenue for that, one of the most effective avenues, is the internet. Alaska, critically important due to the fact that, you know, we have such a large state. Of course, Alaska, you won't want to think, kind of given its backwoods mentality, would be wired, but we are. We're incredibly wired, and most of the households in Alaska have access to the internet. We use that very effectively from day one with those networks that we described before. But it is absolutely essential that you have that base of support in order to move things forward, and that you recognize that 3.5% that I just noted before, that it is just the margins that make the difference. Don't believe the polling. I mean, the polling that we had in Alaska, even up through, I mean, if you believe the polling, I would have been elected, you know, in the general election. Of course, we could talk about the fraud here in a little bit that happened in the general election.